We're live, we're live, we're live.
This is going to be a preach show.
It's going to be a preach show. I'm ready.
So we got Dedrick Asante Muhammed is going to be here partnering with us in a moment as we get ready to go. I hadn't thought of my, what is racism?
What is racism, Diane?
Well, no, like my racism.
No, I
I'm
know.
going to say it differently. We'll see when we get there in a second. Hey.
Hello.
Dedrick will be joining us in a moment. Today is like a really tough question, right?
Yes.
Can we close the racial wealth divide? It's one of those things people always love talking about, like, hey, what's going on? Good to see you. We always are like, yo, we're going to do this in our lifetime. We're going to do this now. We're going to change this stuff now. And we want to ask, like, practically,
can that actually happen?
Actually do that thing.
Right, especially considering all of the policies that led us to this happened over many generations and all of that kind of stuff. So I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Yep.
We'll see what happens. Hold on. Let me see.
Making sure Dedrick is here with us.
Yes. Let's see if he's hopping on. Yeah. Oh, there you are.
There we go. All right, let's bring him in and let's get started.
Let's do it. Waiting for bridging the racial wealth divide.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing. Bridging.
Hey, Dedrick.
Hey.
Hello.
We have Dedrick Asante Muhammed in the building.
We do. We're ready to roll.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's start. Racism is a garbage fire, and if you feel it in your heart that you're tired, you got to preach to the choir so they know what to sing. This is the Preach to the Choir podcast, where we talk about how culture affects the racial wealth divide and vice versa. Recorded live from wherever we reside, we have our hosts, Pamela Capalid, the certified financial planner and founder of Brunch and Budget. We have Dedrick Asante Muhammed, the chief of, it's not Race, Wealth, and Inclusion anymore. It's
Race, Wealth, and Community.
And Community. I always forget that part now. Race, Wealth, and Community at NCRC.
Yeah.
And I'm Dialect. I'm the tour guide and research assistant for the Museum of Dead Words. Preach to the Choir is part of the Race and Wealth Podcast Network.
Yes. All right. So we have a big question to answer today, a very big question. And I feel like it's a question that people have been trying to answer in our generation for a long time. Can we close the racial wealth divide in a generation?
Yes. No.
Yes. No. Maybe.
No, yes.
I don't know.
Should we close the racial wealth?
Is there a short answer to this, Dedrick?
We should close
it
if we could.
So, yes, I think it's possible. Obviously, it would cost a lot in the shorter time period you're doing it. The more it's going to cost per year. I think generally I'm most emphatic on are we on a path to close the racial wealth divide? If it takes 20 years or if it takes 40 years, as long as we're on that path, particularly when we recognize that we've been on a path of growing racial wealth inequality. It's not even that most people approach the issue that like we haven't been moving fast enough, and it's not even that we've been moving in the wrong direction. So I've been so beaten down by trying to advocate for this work. I would just be happy if we get on the path of the right direction and do it in the next 20, 40 years, because we're talking significant amounts of money, which maybe we can get into a little bit more. I don't think people understand how big the racial wealth divide is and how much money it would cost to bridge it.
Yeah.
Well, and as you say that, there's a lot of people who are demanding it now, right? A lot of people are like, we need to fix this and do this, and we're going to do it now, and I need to see it done now, and I need to see the thing that's just going to do it.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the difficulty. It's just not a thing that's just going to do it.
Yeah. No, I think that we're looking for the magic bullet. I think that we have the tendency to want the magic bullet for these kinds of things without really taking into account how complex this is, not only on the financial side, but also on the reason why we do this show is because art and media have told us that, like, well, this is maybe just how it should be, right?
Yeah,
so we're also combating a lot of just like societal things that are telling us, like, well, maybe that's not what's supposed to happen.
I think it's what we're combating is the belief that bullets can be magic, because if bullets had the possibility of being magic, we'd be solving a lot of our problems.
If that's all it took for a magic bullet, huh? That'd be pretty easy. With our level of defense spending, we should be able to do that pretty easy.
Well, I mean, that's really the thing. It's like, you know, the idea that we call this a magic bullet rather than we're calling it a magic letter opener or something like that. It's not like a tool we're talking about. We talk about a weapon, and we're trying to add on some social services to a weapon that's only there to cause death.
Even the phrase magic bullet.
Come on, like we was talking about how, like, oh, you know, one of the things with the police is they're doing too many jobs, but it's like a metaphor that's indicative of the whole thing.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, so going back to what you said, Dedrick, about like creating policy that at least is working towards closing the racial wealth divide, because right now our policies are working against, they're working on widening the racial wealth divide right now, right?
And doing a great job.
And doing a great job of it. It's working. I mean, if you see, even just within this pandemic, to see like the wealthiest billionaires grow their wealth by, you know, $700 billion, while there's 30 million Americans still in unemployment, while there's people not able to make their rent, things like that. I mean, I feel like that this moment in time is growing the racial wealth divide in a lot of ways. So if we're not going to close the racial wealth divide in one generation, what are the things that you feel we need to put in place to start moving in the right direction?
Yeah, well, and two, I just want to highlight, I think you're bringing in two important pieces, right? There's the racial wealth divide, and there's the general concentration of wealth, right? Because, you know, we could have, even when this country wasn't having such a regressive economy where the wealthy were getting almost all of the gains of the growth in the economy, even in the 60s and 70s or 50s and 60s, when you had a more progressive economy, there still was this massive racial wealth divide that wasn't being addressed. So, you know, I think it shows the added challenge we have is that we're in a massively aggressive economy where even among whites, you're seeing a concentration of wealth among the absolute wealthiest. And then with, you know, blacks and Latinos, you're seeing groups that are in such, you know, deep levels of asset poverty. How do we bridge that in terms of median? But, you know, you were asking, you know, what do we think we can do to address the racial wealth divide in a generation or two or what have you? And, you know, what we haven't done, which is what we need to do, is have some big policy that does do serious investments that will disproportionately or solely go to the Black and brown communities that you want to see grow economically and grow in wealth, right? And that can be everything from a universal program like baby bonds to something more specific like reparations for African Americans and Native Americans, and reparations can be 1,000 different things. Part of reparations should be transferring significant amounts of money and investment into these communities. So, you know, those are the things I would like to see, is that a massive federal investment targeted at bridging those things. We haven't done that. At best, they would criticize welfare and say, oh, we kept some people from starving and we kept a lot of Black people from starving, so now we're equal. And it's like, huh? No, that's not bridging the racial wealth divide. Like, including African Americans and others in social welfare programs that existed for whites for 30 or 40 years prior. That's not bridging the racial. You know, you should do that. We should be included in all programs. But, and I guess that's part of the difference, is you can be fighting discrimination, but that doesn't mean, and you can be doing a positive policy. But just because you're doing those things doesn't mean that you're actually bridging the racial wealth divide, right? And you have to have real clear analysis and metrics if that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah, so like a gesture is not the same thing as accomplishing something. I think that's something that folks need to get, because I wanted to note that when you're saying about reparations being needed for Black Americans as well as Native Americans, I already heard in the back of my head the people who are like, but wait a second, Native Americans already got treaties and lands and reservations and casinos and stuff. Aren't they good? Aren't they taken care of? And one, no. And two, just because more than nothing happened doesn't mean that you did enough to do any sort of bridging or building. And also, when we talk about the Native American population, think about how many of those treaties and things have been gone back on, even in recent years.
Oh, yeah. No, for sure. Well, and I think, too, Dedrick, you brought up a point that we were talking about before the show about this idea of, you know, the difference between implementing universal or race neutral policies, right? And then maybe that will like trickle down into closing the racial wealth divide versus doing targeted policies that directly positively affect Black and brown communities. Do we need to focus on one or the other?
Yeah, you just said versus in there. Like we can't be doing both of those things.
Yeah, and how would how would all of that work? Like, what are kind of the big policies that you feel like, you mentioned baby bonds, you mentioned reparations, we talked about a universal jobs guarantee. We've talked about like a universal safety net in general, right? Like a social safety net in general on this show. Like, what would it take? Like, if you were to be able to, I say magic again, but if you were to be able to wave a magic wand, right? If you could, Dedrick Asante Muhammed, knowing everything you know, close the racial wealth divide in a generation, what would you put in place?
Yeah, I would do a mixture of a, you know, recreating the American middle class for the 21st century, some type of massive investment in rebuilding and making it racially inclusive for the first time, in addition to reparations, right? Reparations that is aimed at, you know, financial transfer of money and also recognizing the history, contemporary reality, and, you know, and apologizing in a sense and doing education. So I would do both of those things, right? Kind of like Green New Deal, but more like for Black people, a red, black, and green New Deal. And, you know, and part of that red, black, and green New Deal would be a reparations component. And that since we're doing it for African Americans, Native Americans, only about 1% of the population, let's just add them on and let's just give them reparations too, and really help get past our white supremacist legacy. And, you know, and then there's a whole bunch of policies that could be tied into that for the, you know, kind of 21st century middle class stuff. I would focus on the universal policies, right? Like, I think there should be universal employment, right? There should be universal health care. There does need to be massive spending on recreation of infrastructure, which can help us with jobs and which can help us with having stronger and better communities. So that's where I put on this rebuilding the American middle class, which hopefully was beneficial to everyone, society as a whole, and even those who aren't owed reparations, but have just suffered under being in a regressive economy that didn't have a lot of basic social welfare for its people. And then I would have in particular reparations for African Americans, Native Americans. I thought it more in the sense of African Americans. I wrote a piece in The Guardian about a direct money transfer of around $20,000 a year every year for 20 years. So like that is a generation. I don't think that by itself closes the racial wealth divide. And actually, I think the full effects of that would be over a couple generations, right? Because even for 20 years, the idea that that everyone within that 20 years, born in that 20 years, would continue to get the funding. So that, you know, and so it would go multi-generation. And part of the reason I framed it that way was because, and we talked about this before, is we wanted to have enough funding over enough amount of time that people can make mistakes, could do some things to pay off debts, but then also have money at the end and over time to also invest in different type of assets that will give them returns and create wealth. So, you know, it's something that needs to happen over time. So that's why I had that 20-year, $20,000. But there's many other proposals of, you know, some type of land grants or free college or these types of things. But I think we do have to give material money or baby bonds.
Yeah.
Can I throw on there, since we're magic wanding, I want to add some magic green lighting there too. Because for those things to work out and for people to accept them, there also have to be two major changes. We have to have major changes in our education and major changes in our art. And the major change in our education is the idea that we only have a zero-sum situation.
Right.
That if I have something, that you have to have something taken away from you.
Right, because I think that's the fear when people hear reparations, right? They're like, well, I'm not Black. Are you going to take the money from me? Yeah. And I think that, is that right?
Well, yeah,
the idea of zero-sum capitalism.
And actually, I'm saying this wrong because it's really the zero-sum capitalism part is really what needs to be done in the arts part. And in the education part, we need to take away the idea that an A is the only appropriate grade to get. You know, there's this idea that, because you guys know this from school. I remember when you had the extra credit where you can get 105% on your test. Like that's not even a real thing. That's making bad math. But you put it 105% on your test because it's not even good enough to be the best. You have to be the best, or else you're nothing.
Yeah.
We have to be able to remove that from our education system, that fumbling through, as you were saying, Dedrick, about making mistakes. People have this big idea in our heads that the only appropriate way to be poor is to never make a mistake, save spartanly, and to find that little opportunity and explode that into becoming rich, or at least changing your status.
Well,
And that's an education thing. The idea that we're taking from each other, like, the poorest white folks have to know that we're probably not taking from you to be giving to reparations. The white folks who believe that, and many folks who believe that they are middle class but are actually doing way better than just the middle, they are going to have something taken from them, and we have to understand that that is okay.
No, commenting on that point about the idea of not being able to make mistakes, it's like we have that kind of thought, but at the same time, the whole kind of Silicon Valley, like, there's no mistakes, there's only lessons learned.
Right, fail forward. Why did they get to have that culture, right? Why did they get to have that allowance?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Like, that's right. When a poor person, a poor Black person says, well, hey, I'm going to have a little bit of money and I'm going to buy something nice for myself, like some shoes, and I'm not saving it in a 401k because I really don't even see myself living to get the 401k. People don't frame that as a fail forward. They just frame it as a failure and who they are, and also a justification of why they're in that situation, right? So I just want to highlight how we can, think one group is just failures and the other people fail forward just because they magically, whatever they do, right or wrong, it's progress for them. And there's some truth to that because we have been in a white supremacist society, so that they can fail over and over again. And most of the people from that class are still going to be generally economically okay. They might not be millionaires, but most of them will generally be okay. So I thought that was an important piece of what you were talking about.
Yeah, and that does go along those racial lines, because as you're saying that, I'm thinking about, your social network type films where they talk about white moneyed entrepreneurs who fail and make mistakes and get to where they need to be.
Well, and that hero's journey is like celebrated.
Right. Well, but like when you contrast it with even rich Black people, like when you think of and those are usually going to be creatives, like look at like the Biggie one that they did. He had to be extremely competent in what he did. He could not make failures. He could have made sacrifices.
Yeah, but every decision he made, every step that he took was exactly right.
Well, and especially in the way that they would portray it in media. It was all successful steps.
Yeah.
Oh, he got Little Kim and made her a thing, and that was a successful step, and all these things building on each other. That's the only path that you get.
Yeah.
Well, and also your zero sum idea that people think of it in that way. I think that is actually one of the reasons why, some people are like you said, we can either do a Green New Deal or, mass investment in the middle class. And actually, Obama said this. I've been reading Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen's book, From Here to Equality. And in that book, it notes how when Obama was asked about reparations, I think it was right after he became president, he went on this thing about how, well, I don't think we can get reparations. And I think, through universal policies to build the middle class, that will solve it, and we can get that. So we're going to, do that. So it was kind of almost like it was never in his mind, we can try to do both. It was, well, we can't do this. This we can probably do, though it didn't really happen under his 8 years of administration. We didn't rebuild the American middle class. But and it's the only way I want to tie that together is I just do think actually they need to be tied together so that people can see that it's going to be a gain for everybody, even as we particularly target particular groups.
Right. Well, and I mean, going back to something that you said earlier about how the reason why you need to give a Black American $20,000 a year for 20 years is because in those first 4, 5, 6 years, they're catching up. Right? Yeah. It's why you can't just do universal policies across the board. It's why you have to do targeted policies towards Black and brown families, because there's this catch-up factor that we don't consider. We don't consider how behind Black and brown families already are right now. And if we just do these like race-neutral universal policies, then maybe we'll close the racial wealth divide by default, but it'll take so much longer because we're not addressing the direct issues, the debt that was accrued, the lack of health care, the lack of mental health, all of these things are accumulated that Black and brown families need help catching up to.
Well, and you were saying earlier about how everything that we're doing is sending us in the negative direction. So if we have, 10 policies that are going in the negative and we create one new, even powerful one that's going in the positive, that's still not going to fix things. And if we already have a tendency to be racially unfair with how we distribute these things, that's probably going to continue if we don't do something about that part.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I think this is where the art and media really come in, because at the end of the day, these policies are administered by people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't think about that aspect of it, if we think like, oh, we just create the policy, we just create the program, like if you look at the GI Bill abuses in the 1940s, right, where technically every veteran was able to access VA loans to buy a home. They were able to access higher education, but Black veterans in particular were pushed towards vocational schools. Black veterans in particular were denied home loans, even though they were veterans. And so if we don't change how people think and feel about wanting to close the racial wealth divide, and we don't address that in the art and the media, then we're not going to be able to do it either, just with policy.
If we don't make it real, it never will be real. How many times have you seen white people react to these brands who have, like, on blackout days when they're like, we support yada, yada, yada. And I've seen so many people say, actually not just white people, so many people say, I don't believe you. You had to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, trust.
And I think you bring up an interesting point too, that like, we have a history of coming up on 100 years of theoretically race-neutral policies. When you start looking at, and you get to the 1940s and 50s in particular, they're supposed to be building the American middle class that weren't race-neutral in implementation, right? So, and again, I don't mean to dismiss universal policies. And actually, let's go back to the baby bonds piece and the idea of closing things within a generation. I think, because there is this idea, like, I'm not, if we want to do comprehensive, if we did the Green New Deal and serious reparations, it's possible you could do maybe bridge the racial wealth divide in 20 years, after spending, I would estimate anything from 10 to 20 trillion dollars. I think you probably could, but like, that's the type of money we're talking about. Well, and even with the baby bonds piece, I've heard some people say that they could close the racial wealth divide in a generation through baby bonds, high-level baby bonds, $50,000 for the poorest. But, I mean, we got to think about that usually you don't get the baby bond until after you're 18 or 20.
Yep.
Right? So that means that if we started it tomorrow in 2021, people won't be getting that money until even start getting that money till a generation from now. Right? So that's not in a generation. That's in a generation will start, and then how will it go forward in the future. So you just got to think about all of these things about, what is the timetable? We want some things to immediately move forward now, and that can build wealth over generations.
Yeah, that brings up the idea of like all the technicalities that are involved. Because like, I guess, like maybe it is possible to take down and remove the racial wealth divide in a generation, not this generation. Some abstract generation out there, it could happen, right? Somewhere like 25, 33 to 25, 85, they'll like maybe that one.
Our kids' generation will be, well, and I guess that's the thing is that it is a lofty and maybe overly ambitious and maybe unrealistic idea but to close something in a generation that took multiple generations to get here, right?
I mean, it's taken hundreds of years to get where we are today. I think it's a fine goal. What I don't like is just, and I was on a radio show in New Orleans yesterday, and this guy was talking about how nonprofit foundations like to fund a nonprofit $100,000 for a $10 million problem, and then wonder why the problem isn't solved. And that's just my thing. If we're going to say we're going to close the racial wealth divide in a generation, then fine, put the funding, the 10 to 20 trillion dollars needed to do that in a generation, but don't say we're going to do that through I don't know,
One
stronger
thing.
stronger unemployment checks, right? Or
Right.
I don't know, a few more grants or scholarships at Black colleges. Like, no, that's not going to close.
Hmm.
What is the massive amount of money we're pouring in to do that?
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
that makes me think of what was it that Hassan Minhaj said about, when you're trying to negotiate for something, you need to shoot for even higher. I think he was talking about healthcare and about like universal healthcare is like we should have shot even farther, asked for like crazy ridiculous things. Like everyone has their own. Was that Harry Kondabolu who said that?
Yeah.
Some stand-up comedian. I'm messing up.
He was like, maybe for our health care, we should just eat the rich, and that will provide the nutrition that we need to be healthy, and then we would have landed at universal health care.
So
that would have seemed like the reasonable option.
And so the thing I'm asking, like, is it that people are limited in what they're asking, and what's happening is they're like trying to negotiate, and this is the consequence of, because I think a lot of these policies, when you dig into the history of them, you see someone was trying to do something that would have been had a major effect,
right?
But by the time they get it to a bill, it's so watered down that it's like
then it's Obamacare.
Well, yeah, but then it's like, but people then are like, well, then is it worth it to do it? Because then that's on the other side. It's like, well, then it's not enough. Forget it all.
Yeah. Well, that's it. No, I think that's exactly right. When I said Prosperity Now, we did a paper on individual IDAs or CSAs, I guess, it was children's savings accounts, and the original writings around some of that individual development accounts, I think, went up to $10,000, $20,000 that every person would get to start off seed and would grow into money. But by the time they could actually get test pilots, these children's savings accounts were like $50 or something like that, right? But the people believed in this idea of children's savings accounts that are kind of like baby bonds so much that they kept trying to talk about the important contribution it could make, but overlooking that. I mean, it's great we have some pilot projects for $50, $100, or $500. But we're just lying to people when we say that's going to close the racial wealth divide. We can say this is an important program to learn, but we need to say, the level that it's going to require to actually make substantive difference in people's lives are going to be a lot more, but it's hard to get votes that way. And so then people, and that's the challenge. It's like we always try to make the politic, we have this realism of the policies we think we can pass, we try to make it seem like those are the solutions to our problems instead of recognizing, no, that was just the policy we could pass. That wasn't the solution.
Yeah. Well, I mean, going back to what you said about closing the racial wealth divide would cost $10 to $20 trillion. I feel like the first thing that people will ask is like, where's that money coming from, right? Where's that money coming from, Dedrick? That's a lot of money.
From people who worked hard to earn it.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, and I'll say, one thing is I spent some time with a mentor of mine, Chuck Collins, who's really been focused on redistributing wealth, right? And he really believes that it's not only important to build wealth from the bottom up, but to also bring some of the ceiling down to help deal with inequality. So, and that's why many of the reports we have, a wealth estate tax and these different types of, taxing policies that should contribute more to wealth development. Because as I've said many times, we spend over $700 billion a year in wealth development. The problem is most of that money goes to the wealthy. So we're constantly reinvesting in wealth development for the wealthy. So we should take that near, 700 billion is pretty close to $1 trillion, right? You do that for 20 years, that's almost 20 trillion. Like you're getting there. But so there is tax policy, but also there's a greater recognition that you don't have to raise taxes every time you spend money. And we can look at the recent, COVID bailouts where within a month, all of a sudden we had bailouts or investments anywhere from 2 trillion to 6 trillion. I've seen estimates.
Depending on on the Fed multiple, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's depending on the Fed multiple. And there's no taxes raised. It actually came right after Trump's tax cut of about a year ago for many of the wealthiest. So, and the idea is that actually countries like ours that print our own money, we actually aren't really going into deficit. The only thing we have to worry about is if we print so much money that it affects inflation. So honestly, when you start looking at it that way, there's a lot of money that can't be spent, you know, and
There is.
go back to the Iraq war and all these other wars. We don't raise taxes before we invade and bomb a country and spend hundreds of billions of dollars. We just do it, and somehow it works out. So I think the money is there. It's just the will hasn't been.
Yeah, I mean, and just to go back to the $4 to $6 trillion, we talked about this on the show before, but it's not just the dollars. It's so the actual amount that was passed by Congress was $450 billion to go to corporations, right? The thing is, though, that because that money was being issued by the Treasury, the Federal Reserve deemed that money much more reliable. So they decided that they would feel comfortable leveraging it up to 10 times on the dollar, which is how $450 billion turns into $4.5 trillion for corporations. And so it's not even necessarily printing money. It's the Fed saying, hey, we're going to take this $450 billion and we're going to allow corporations to borrow it at 10 times on the dollar. And that's really how we create money also, is with debt and with leveraging debt.
Well, and the thing that the big word of what you said is that they trust them. They trust them that they're like, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah,
you can make
the
it 10
Treasury's
times
good
on that.
for it.
You're
Yeah.
good for it. You'll be cool.
No, I think that's important. You bring up that other tool of, I'm kind of highlighting the idea that we really can print money, but you're highlighting also that you can leverage money as well. One of the interesting reparations proposals I've heard was the idea that every, person who's deemed should get reparations would get $50,000 tax credit toward a real estate purchase.
Oh, yeah, I saw that too.
And what I found, what I like about that is, $50,000 can easily be leveraged to $200,000, $300,000 more, up to $500,000, maybe even more, a piece of property or home or what have you. And it's a way of giving out a good amount of money without having to actually give the $500,000, and two, it's something that hopefully would last over generations. So I think there's many different tools and ideas outside of the kind of blunt instrument I put forward, around $20,000 a year for every person. Though I think honestly, a mix of those types of things is something, because again, you can't eat off your $50,000 estate tax credit, right? If you really need some money to help get you a better apartment in a safer neighborhood, or to buy better quality food for your kid, you're not going to be able to get returns on a $50,000 tax credit for years. You need some immediate assistance, and that's where the idea of of immediate cash is also needed to deal with this racial wealth divide.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many multiple things that need to happen and be addressed. Even just the little things you said, which are big things, about like putting your kids, putting good food in front of your kids, right? Being able to address mental health, being able to address like physical health, all of these kinds of things can be addressed with money. Yeah.
They're not little things. That's the thing of it. Is that they're details.
Yeah.
And because they're multifarious and multifaceted, they seem like little things because we have to look at them from a really far away lens. Yeah. And I think that's the really important part of it, right? Is that these things have to be addressed. Otherwise, the money will go into what seems like a sink pit. It'll just be gone.
Yeah.
Or it's not going to be enough to get you above.
One thing as we're talking that I'm realizing, it's kind of an interesting theme for a show, and maybe fits into this one, is like the positive socioeconomic things we've learned through the COVID crisis. And that, again, that there is money that can be spent when needed to help people. There were some new shows watching, and they were talking about how they were, the cities are giving money to small restaurants and small entrepreneurs selling food to give out free food, to help, to do a twofer, right? To help small business and to help those that are dealing with food insecurity, and then I was thinking, if you did something like that ongoing, particularly aimed at businesses that are undercapitalized, like Black and Latino businesses, and just made that an ongoing program that, Black and Latino restaurants or food businesses, or you can go into other businesses, are getting government money to do these things for service, because so many Black, Latino businesses, Native American businesses want to serve their communities. And it can be quite challenging when you're in asset poverty to then try to figure out how to make a profit by serving people in asset poverty. But if the government could invest in that, and you're creating institutions and you're giving, nutrients to people, I think that's the type of thing that, could provide some promise in addition to other policies.
I love that.
Well,
That's
but
so creative.
isn't investing, here's some, the people who will play devil's advocate will say, so it doesn't sound like this is my thing. Isn't investing in one community over another community playing favorites and favoritism? And isn't favoritism when the government funds one thing over another thing wrong? So wouldn't that be a situation of two wrongs not making a right?
Well, I mean, no. And basically, basically, if there's someone hungry on the street and I give them a granola bar, I might not have given it to the other person who seemed fine standing on the street. Why would I give just a random person the granola bar? Like I could have, right? But, and people have done this through memes, right? About all houses matter, where they have a picture of a house on fire and then another picture of a house not on fire. And someone's like, well, why are you spraying all the water on the house that's on fire? Don't all houses matter? Well, like, no, because there's a house on fire, because you're dealing with a particular issue. That's why we would, and that's why that's why I have programs for the poor. We don't, a lot of the programs aren't for everybody because we understand they're in crisis. That's why we created Social Security. It wasn't just because we liked old people. There was a massive problem of elderly being in poverty, of like sometimes even actually starving. So we created a Social Security system that helped people when they got in that situation. We need to recognize the history of racial inequality. We've had people maintained in economic disenfranchisement for centuries, and we're finally going to deal with that, So,
yeah.
So no.
Okay, yeah. Well, no, I love that. Yeah, so let the choir sing. You don't own everything you survey. You are not the Lion King. I'm just saying. Well, again, that's like a thing that we need to unlearn, is that like all of the stuff out there is not ours, not made for us, not only for us.
Yeah, you don't have to take advantage of every program. You don't have to qualify for every program, especially if it's not for you.
Well, no, and it's okay if there are programs that benefit people who are other than you.
Yeah, because you benefit from programs that did not benefit them.
Yeah.
And that's what happens. I mean, I want to end the conversation.
And two, you benefit by having other people benefit. I mean, the idea,
yes,
like the idea that you have to get the exact amount out of some pot to make it fair. No, like we benefit when we have a society that is generally, prosperous. And again, hopefully that's something we've learned from COVID, right? You can't have good health care and you be tested and COVID is done, right? Like, no, COVID's not done until the masses are tested, until the masses, until we quarantine this in society as a whole, not just in you and your family.
Yep, exactly. And I think this is the perfect way to end the conversation, this idea of private wealth versus public wealth, right? This idea of like, I need to accumulate as much wealth individually for me and my family to close the racial wealth divide, or whatever XYZ to build generational wealth, versus creating public policy that creates public wealth where you don't have to make as much money because your healthcare is taken care of, because your school is taken care of, because you don't have student loans, because you're not worried about going hungry, because you're not worried about finding affordable housing. The reason why there's this feeling that we all have to make so much more money is because we have to cover so many things individually that so many other countries and so many other economies cover publicly for their citizens.
So less Lion Kings, more hyenas with a reason to laugh.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the idea that we can take what's mine and make it into ours is very difficult and very scary. I keep bringing up like these kids' films and all because it starts very early, the idea that what's mine is mine and I must fight for the thing that is mine. Even if I don't have a great understanding of all the roots that build this tree that I now claim as mine.
Right. Well, the myth of individualism is another huge art thing, right? It was a huge, like, oppressive art movement that when we talk about bootstrapping, when we talk about the American dream, when we talk about rags to riches, it's all built upon this myth of individualism and this concept of like, I have to do it all myself. And if I don't do it, then someone else is going to take something away from me.
And you can see this throughout popular culture. I think one of the big things about the myth of individuality that we don't give enough credence to is the popularity of sports. Throughout the majority of our parents' generation, boxing was the #1 sport, and it was the most individual thing. I straight up beat your behind, and you were less than me. As those things transitioned into our team sports, we give a lot of lip service to teamwork and unity and things like that. But who do you know in every sport? You know the MVP.
Yeah.
And
only know the one guy.
And there is so much of the race and wealth stuff in that, also. But there's this idea that there is a conqueror. even when we talk about wars in history, we talk about the conqueror. We don't talk about the army.
Yeah.
Even, you know, when we break things down to as small as possible, that whole 300 people at Thermopylae was really more like 10,000 people at Thermopylae, but it's a funner story when you're saying like it's one dude.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or when we're looking at the wars, we look at the generals
Yep.
versus the mass of people fighting. You know, and I think, you know, one other thing I just want to highlight is, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, you know, recreating public assets. And the last time we had kind of mass investments was the creation of the white American middle class in the 1940s and 50s. And I think, you know, there was some economic truths to this in the United States, that industry was booming in the United States in particular. Manufacturing was booming. And so there was some type of calculus that could be made that actually the best way to distribute many of these resources, healthcare, pension, these types of things, are through these new massive corporations and industry. But we're not in that space anymore, right? Where we have massive corporations, but they don't hire at massive ways, right? They just kind of concentrate wealth, have a pretty elite workforce. And so I think we need to do a new 21st century investment, and we're going to find that actually private industry isn't the best way to distribute healthcare. We've already gotten rid of pensions as a serious way to kind of help the aged. And so it will go back to government as the way to be the best distributor of these resources that create strong public wealth that fits with this idea that you have a job one day, you don't have a job the next day. But even if you don't have a job, you still might have access to income, food, healthcare, and it allows for the creative destruction people say is necessary to move the economy forward. We just don't all have to be destroyed to have that capitalist creation.
Yeah. And as you say, you know, government, I think that also raises people's hackles and gets them nervous. But again, creatively, artistically, educationally, we have to remove the idea that the government is a separate entity from us, that it is not the idea of it, and that it can't be something that is the will of the people. When all you tell people is that broccoli doesn't taste good, and then you worry about why the kids aren't eating their greens, it's self-evident.
Yeah.
Well, and, you know, and I think another lesson, hopefully being learned from COVID, is there's some things that only government can do. Like Apple is not going to stop COVID, right? Like, or, you know, what Facebook is not going to it's only through, you know, government, which is us, you know, and it's all of us connected in some way through voting. Some of us are disenfranchised, it's fine, but it's the only massive entity that really can deal with those types of issues. And you can point similarly to the West Coast fires or to these large issues of inequality. Like, that has to be government. I think people had these illusions that the private sector was going to solve these things. The private sector has done little to nothing as it relates to COVID. And we've seen by relying on a private sector, I think our heavy reliance in this country to substitute the public sector is what's made our country the worst in the developed world in dealing with COVID in a true public crisis.
Yeah.
Wow, will we figure out that we cannot rely on the billionaire private class to save us before the number of Batman adaptations outranks the number of Dracula adaptations? We might already be there.
Yeah.
I just wanted to throw out that, you know, again, when we talk about the things we've been raised on the idea that the rich and the elite and the powerful in many ways are the ones that are the only ones who can save us.
Yeah.
I'm going to think about this idea of Batman and Dracula, because I think there's a lot of things we can do about, you know, blood sucking and a millionaire vigilante, you know, how do these things go together? I'm going to think about that.
We also need some kind of superhero that's like a government worker. That would be great.
In the X-Men, they had the Freedom Force, which was originally contracted the original X-Men to work for the government, and then they, to continue our cynicism about the government, they immediately replaced them with supervillains.
Oh, great.
And then the supervillains were sent out on a secret government mission to do some even shadier stuff than the supervillains wanted to do, and then the government had them all killed.
Hey, superhero that was a government official. I know this is monarchy, but Black Panther.
Okay, right? Well, he was the monarch.
He was, yeah.
He was the head of state. And actually, and we can get into this later, but I think Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I like a lot, might have actually got a little bit into a neoliberal critique by trying to bring down Black Panther as a strong monarch, and the idea that should be separated to more like a different type of a different type of democracy, and that what isn't what a superhero should be. But I find that I like that idea, that interesting, of kind of exploring what a superhero is and related to government, and what that means for our thinking about how change occurs, not through some one. Because you're right, in movies it's always the person that doesn't take orders,
Yeah.
and the person that by themselves is saving the masses. Versus, honestly, the people who save us are usually the people who are taking orders and are willing to help for a general cause, even though they're not making all the decisions at that moment.
Yep.
Well, and to finish that off, remember that, in real life, we're less likely to get a Black Panther as a monarch, and we're more likely to get a Dr. Doom, who is well beloved in his home kingdom of Latveria, but he's out there destroying the rest of the world. And that's what we do a lot, y'all. Yeah. We are pretty okay because we think of ourselves at war. We think of us, it's not just a zero-sum situation. It's that if I don't do this to you, one of you will do this to me. Mm-hmm. It's scary. I discussed this in my theater show where I talked about the word hypocrite. Hypocrite was originally created to make sure that you could see the wolves in the sheep's clothing. But now we simply use it to say that everybody is a wolf or is a potential wolf. So now we have no trust over anyone but ourselves. It's why people say this do your own research nonsense, even if you ain't been trained in doing your own research.
I love it. All right, take us out, Dad.
All right, I'm gonna take us out. I'm taking us out, but I gotta ask. We gotta do some democracy because I got 3 really dope songs that I like, and I didn't have time to decide. So without asking too many things, Dedrick, American or French?
French.
Okay. Then if it's French, then I have a second question. Is it hard body or is it relaxed?
Relaxed.
Relaxed. Okay, so we are going to France for an artist named Moni DBH featuring Papillon with their song. The song is Generation Future. And I was saying, the chill one because they describe their sound as French G-Funk. And that's what we got. We hope you guys... Well, we didn't say at least we could do and most you could do. Least you could do is listen to what we say, and the most you could do is do something with it. So go and do stuff with it, whether you're from this place or you're from another one, and we can continue to build this choir, preach to them, know what they're singing. Check y'all next time. Thank you a lot. Peace.
Thank you, everybody.